The Cleveland Superior line of instruments is commonly found in school bands. It's fairly well respected, but generally considered to be a decent student-grade instrument, and that tends to be the extent of what you hear about Cleveland Superiors. But those in the know, who know the history behind them, realize that these are a batch of instruments that really punch above their weight class, and I think that, combined with the fact that we see them in school bands most often, make them a really apt candidate for what we do here on the Scholastic Brass Special on the Samuel Plays Brass channel. Last year on the Scholastic Special, we reviewed a Cleveland Superior trombone, and today I am back with its trumpet and cornet counterpart, and I want to tell you about them and my experiences with them. I want to start this video off with a brief history and an attempt at relieving any confusion you may have between names such as H&White, King, and Cleveland. You may recognize these instruments as what you might call King designs. You might hear brand names like King and H&White used interchangeably. You may in fact be familiar with King Cleveland model instruments like the Cleveland 600 trumpet, which I've talked about on the channel, the Cleveland 602 cornet, the Cleveland 605 trombone. So where do these three brand names meet, and how do we square this whole thing away so that we actually know what we're talking about here? The story starts in the year 1919 with the short-lived but well-regarded Cleveland Musical Instruments Company. They got into the business of making band instruments in 1919 and very quickly began struggling as a company, but not because people didn't appreciate or purchase their products, but in fact, conversely, because they succumbed to their own success and could not keep up with production demands. So in 1922, they phoned H&White for help. H&White did graciously help with manufacturing for a couple of years, but ultimately in 1925, they bought out and swallowed up the Cleveland Musical Instruments Company. And between the years of 1925 all the way through to 1965, H&White offered Cleveland Company designs to some extent, as they were definitely modified and adapted for the H&White assembly line, of the Cleveland Company's Superior and American Standard models. In the Cleveland line, the American Standard was the lower budget option of the day, and the Superior was supposed to be a cut above that. It was supposed to be the Cleveland Company's premier models. Under the leadership of the H&White Company, both of those models were sort of relegated to the bottom rungs of the ladder and both became budget instruments or early examples of student instruments. But that being said, H&White really prided themselves on the fact that their top King Craftsmen would work on everything from the Cleveland instruments all the way up to their premier professional instruments, things like their Liberty models. This trumpet was the model 600B Cleveland, which post-1965 would go on to be the King Cleveland 600 trumpet, and this cornet was the model 601B, which is interesting because I think post-1965, almost all of the King Cleveland cornets I've seen have been the model 602. The reason I mentioned the year 1965 as kind of a break point in the company's history, and we go from Cleveland models to King Cleveland models, is because in the year 1965, H&White officially went under, was bought out by Seaberg Musical Corporation, and was rebranded at that point to King Musical Instruments. Before that, it was H&White making King Instruments, and that's where they got their prestige from, kind of a model or trim name. But then King actually became the name of the company making the instruments, and H&White dissolved. And what's really interesting is in the last few years of H&White production, in the last decade or so between 55 and 65, you can actually see the H&White company taking the King brand or model or trim name more and more seriously, and it taking more and more of a center stage in their company branding. You can see little differences, in fact, in the way that these instruments were made around that time, and that's the next segment that I want to get into. And so in taking a closer look at our two instruments today and showing you their features, I also want to kind of compare the types of features that we see on a Cleveland Superior made in the late 1950s versus the early 1960s, because even within that last decade or so that the Cleveland Superior models were made, i.e. before H&White was absorbed and became King Musical Instruments, we saw some design changes showing that the company was heading in that direction. Our trumpet here is the earlier of the two instruments. It was made in the late 50s with a serial number in the early 80,000 range, and the cornet was made a little bit later in the early 1960s, judging by its 120,000 serial number. Just by holding these two instruments up, you may actually be able to start to see the first major difference between the two of them, and that is the lacquer treatment that each of them got. This older Cleveland Superior has that signature King and H&White baked on yellowish epoxy lacquer that has that very deep sort of honey color to it, in comparison to what looks like more of a clear epoxy lacquer on the slightly newer cornet. From there we can look closer and see some finer differences, such as a difference in knurling on the mouthpiece receivers between the two instruments, as well as some differences in the valve block, both in the trim on the top and bottom caps and on the valve cylinders themselves. Inside the valve casing, if you remove any of the valves, although there are slight aesthetic differences, structurally they're very similar. Each of these instruments have top-sprung valves with the spring housed externally of the valve stem and a unidirectional brass valve guide. And we do see a pretty substantial difference in the bell engraving between the two instruments. On the trumpet, we have a blockier sort of engraving saying Superior, the H and White Company, Cleveland O for Ohio, and then the Cleveland brand logo below it. And then on the cornet, we have some rounder and artsier flourishes in general, more in keeping with the 1961 Cleveland Superior trombone that I reviewed last year, and it says Cleveland Superior, made by King Craftsmen, notable part there, the H and White Company, Cleveland, Ohio. And also, we're lucky that with these two instruments, we have the full outfits with which presumably they would have originally come, so we see both of the original cases, and the trumpet one is a little bit older looking for sure, and the cornet one has this H and White Company medallion on it, and we also have what are presumably the original mouthpieces of their respective eras. With the trumpet, we got this H and White Company T model, and presumably there was an H and White Company C model for cornet as well, that would have had the exact same upper part dimensions, just with the proper fitting shank for their cornets. And then we have this slightly later era cornet mouthpiece just engraved King MC, and it's got this interesting steeped blank that we would also see on some of King's mouthpieces for trombone and baritone, like the M21 and M31, which will be the topic of a video on the channel sometime later. These two mouthpieces are very similar in that they have fairly small inner diameters, kind of around Bach 10.5 land, fairly deep V-shaped cups, resembling maybe something like a Bach B cup, but if anything, even more V-shaped and slim on the sides, and fairly large throats. Neither of these are at all my cup of joe, but if you stick around towards the end of the video, I will let you hear a few notes on each. But with all the nitpicking of differences aside, these two are very similar instruments and models of instrument. Each of them is about a medium-large .460 bore. There are reports of the 600B trumpet having been a large bore, something like 462, but I'm getting about 460 on my micrometer on both of these horns, pretty much no matter which tube I measure. They've also each got somewhat small 4 3/4 inch bells. Typically, these days you would see bells more in the range of 4 7/8. And with their mouthpieces removed, on my kitchen scale, the Cleveland Superior trumpet comes out to about 2 pounds and 5.5 ounces, and the Cleveland Superior cornet comes in just a touch heavier at 2 pounds 6.25 ounces. And although neither of them have first slide adjustment, something that wasn't really popular until probably a couple decades after they were made, we do see an adjustable third slide ring on both of them. And this slide, screw, and ring piece appear to be exactly identical on both of these instruments. I've actually tried putting one of these third slides in place of the other, and they are interchangeable. And something I'll point out is they each have this really cool curved cross bracing between the bell and the lead pipe. I don't see that on hardly any instrument out there, so kind of a cool touch for what is considered kind of a budget instrument or a school grade instrument. The first demo I want to give you in this video is a direct comparison of the two instruments on the same piece of music with very similar, subtly different mouthpiece setups. So here is the Tyrolean song from the Arbin book on each of these instruments. Given the medium to deep type of mouthpiece used on each, both of these instruments sound a little bit thin in tone, i.e. they're lacking some of the depth that you would get with a professional instrument, especially a modern professional instrument, but both of them have fairly well-rounded harmonic spectra, if you will. I put each of them up on a spectrogram on my phone, and both of them had a good deal of low presence and fundamental in their tone, and neither was too edgy in the upper harmonics or too harsh in tone. As far as individual use cases, I have to admit that between the two of them, I prefer the cornet, and what sparked this video and my getting a Cleveland Superior trumpet to test is the fact that I tried my friend's Cleveland Superior cornet, as shown here, in brass band rehearsal one day, and I liked it so much, I figured I not only needed to do a review on it, but I needed to see if the trumpet could hold up. Spoiler alert, I don't like the trumpet quite as much, and it has sort of a distinct use case from the cornet. But anyway, as far as this cornet, which I love so much, I am amazed at how dark and velvety it sounds with something more like a brass band cup. It sounds almost shockingly so. If this thing had a shepherd's crook, it would be unstoppable. You might be seeing it in some casual brass bands. As far as the trumpet goes, even though it is in my opinion the bigger or fuller sounding of the two instruments, I still find it to be a little bit bright and nasal, generally speaking, for classical playing, and as a result, I don't like it quite as much as I do the Cleveland Superior cornet. I mentioned I got this thing as a result of my curiosity and my fascination with the cornet, and I haven't used this thing too much. The thing is, though, even if I'm not the biggest fan of its classical tone, it is very passable as a jazz or marching band horn. Especially if you plug in a pretty shallow mouthpiece, you can really wail or scream on this thing. It really gets into the upper register, it really does the jazz inflection thing nicely, and its tone is, in my opinion, much more fitting for the jazz band or for like an outdoor funk outfit than for the concert band. That's not entirely surprising, seeing as it was built off of the backs of things like the King Liberty trumpet, which I've also reviewed in the card, but that was a very early example of a trumpet, and one that is more adept for jazz band use, frankly, than any sort of classical use. The H.N. White and King companies have, generally speaking, never really made my favorite trumpets out there, and none of them have been the most well-rounded trumpets in my opinion, but you can occasionally come across some real diamonds in the rough in the H.N. White catalog, specifically for jazz playing, and I will admit this Cleveland Superior really does excel in that sort of setting. Anyway, as promised, I'm a glutton for punishment, so despite me not really wanting to, I did decide to try and fart around on the original mouthpieces, with them both being something like a Bach 10.5B. I can't really play on them super well, my range is pretty hampered on either end, and my articulations and flexibility really aren't what they should be, but here you go, quick little jazz lick on each. So with all that being said, along with instruments like the lower tier Yamahas and Getsons, these H.N. White budget models are some of the finer playing student grade instruments out there. They definitely do punch above their weight class, at least if you can find the right use case and the right mouthpiece for each. Both of these do end up being pretty tremendous players once you sort of find that groove and stick with it. Obviously, you can't make a fish climb a tree or a squirrel swim in a lake, so there are certain use cases where I would definitely prefer a Yamaha student trumpet over something like the Cleveland Superior, but these are both great instruments, well deserving of the Sam seal of approval. Maybe the cornet gets one of this size, and the trumpet gets a very slightly smaller one, but I really do think both of these instruments are great value for what they are. And again, that cornet played well enough that it inspired me to not only make this video, but go looking for a Cleveland Superior trumpet. Definitely don't scoff at these or pass them up if you're looking for either a spare instrument or an instrument for your kid or your student or some such thing. These really do play well and are great for school band settings. I really appreciate you sticking around through this video. If you've made it all the way here, please make sure to leave a like and a comment. I always appreciate your support and getting to hear your thoughts on these instruments. We'll be back very shortly with more issues of the Scholastic Brass Special, but until next time, I will see you on the flip side.